Today's motion is, this house would rather be a teenager in the 1980s than the 2020s. To judge this battle of perspectives, we have a very special panel with us today. All distinguished alumni of our very school who once sat in these very seats and debated on this very stage. And now they are back with us, not as participants, but as judges. Our chair for today is Krish Nagrani. On the panel, we have Mehull Girdhar, Drishti Tibrewal, Prithwiraj Purkait, Vyusti Singh, and Miss Najla Bukhari. We are honored to have them here. A big thank you to our alumni for joining us. It's always special when the past returns to meet the present.
Before we begin, a quick note on the format for the audience and participants. Each team will have 2 constructive speeches of 6 minutes each, followed by a reply speech of 4 minutes. Points of information, also known as POIs, may be asked between the first and 6th minute of the constructive speech. We now call upon the teams from Lotus House and Tulip House to take their seats on the stage. We wish both the teams the very best. May your words spark thought and may your voices carry fun. With that, I hand over to our chair, Krish Nagrani, to take the event forward.
Give me a second. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Welcome everyone to the finals of Maldives debate. I'm Krish, I'm your chair for today. Judging with me today on my panel, you already know who they are, they announced it. That's perfect. You guys know the rules. POIs between the first and the last minute only. We'll be timing. You hear a bell at the first minute, 1 bell on the 5th minute, 2 bells on the 6th minute. On 6:15, we'll all put our hands up indicating we're not speaking. At 6:20, I will interrupt you and ask you to stop. I will also keep ringing the bell after 6:20, so please stop so I don't have to do that. Apart from that, wishing both sides the best and may the best have win. With that, inviting first speaker proposition to begin this debate whenever they're ready. Here, here.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. In a world where mental health, safety, and ability to live life to the fullest is completely compromised, I would rather just choose to live a really simple life in the 1980s than face all of these complex issues later in the 2020s. As the first speaker, I'm going to be doing 3 things. Framing, characterization, followed by arguments. My second speaker will further analyze them, and my third speaker will give rebuttals and clashes. So before we move on, what exactly is like life in the 2020s? The most obvious thing to say here is that we were in the middle of a global pandemic, right? Secondly, there was also just a huge access to technology in general, which spiked a lot in the 2020s. A lot of competition and just like a general just large increase in technology, right? Thirdly, we lived a lot isolated, and there was a lack of physical interaction, also because of the global pandemic. And lastly, we were basically focused on survival mode, which basically means that we were focusing on surviving rather than actually doing things, right? Secondly, what is life in the 1980s? So the basic thing to say here is that there was comparatively a lot more physical interaction, a lot more physical activities, and all of this was basically replaced by the rise of technology in the 2020s. Okay, what does being a teenager feel like, right? So firstly, it's the stage before being an adult. This means there's a lot of development taking place here personally and in general, and we're also really sensitive to our environment. As a teenager, the basic interest would be to have a fun, successful life and also ensure safety. Basically, this means that I would rather choose to be happy and maybe prepare for my future a little more as being a teenager. And these are the interests that I would actually face. This motion basically states that as a teenager, in order to ensure that these needs or interests that I have are being fulfilled, I would rather choose to live in the 1980s than in the 2020s because it would be a lot more beneficial for me. Okay, arguments then. Firstly is the access to technology. So we've already established that in the 2020s, the access to technology was a lot more. And we're basically telling you is that this less access to technology was a lot more beneficial for teenagers in the 1980s, right? Why are we saying this? Before this, can we just note that like technology did exist in the 1980s? We're simply saying that the development and the advancement of it was wrong as a teenager and it did not like benefit us at all, right? Three like most important reasons to this. Firstly is bullying in general. Why is bullying important? Because like as a teenager, it's been the major thing that everyone has been suffering from. It's very common and everyone has been bullied like at least once in their life. The problem with this is that it basically follows you home in the 2020s. Like you get bullied at school and then you come back home, you see social media, Instagram and like whatever, and it continues bullying you. You continue like feeling the problems that you have, feeling your insecurities, your mental health drains and your problems just become a lot worse. Cyberbullying became really common in the 2020s, not to mention that like rumors and like whatever spreads really fast again, right? We also see that home was actually our safe space back like in the 1980s. Why is this? Well, it was basically because there was not much technology, there was not much social media, and because of this, even if I get bullied or I feel insecure at school or like wherever else, I could at least go home and like feel better about myself. I could at least go home and reflect about myself and like have alone time to feel as a better individual. So that's why it has like elevated a lot on opposition side here. But secondly is the overuse of technology. So in the 2020s when technology advanced, there was also like a large overuse of it, and we're like seeing a lot of common issues like mental health draining and your eyes strain. You like have a lot of physical and mental exertion, and all of these are related when you decide to like overuse technology on a large scale. Now technology was not developed enough like back in 1980s for this to actually exist on a large scale, and the technologies didn't exist that much for people to get addicted to it, get overuse it as whole, and that's why this isn't like a big problem in today's debate. Thirdly is about social life. So we're basically emphasizing in social life that your physical interaction is really important as a teenager. You need to go and make friends physically. You need to do a lot of physical activities for your mental and physical health, right? And all of this again goes away when you decide to like advance technology, when you decide to use it on a really large extent. And it was really important to actually make friends physically. This completely vanished in the 2020s when we lived life in a completely isolated manner, and it shifted away our focus from this as whole. But also note that overuse of technology, even though it like strains your mental health and physical health and stuff, it also actually just ruins the fun for you in general. We're basically saying that when technology was a new innovation, it was actually a lot more fun for teenagers to use. I was actually like happy to use technology when it was a new innovation, and it made me like a lot more happier and excited when I decided to use it. But now when we see technology, it's become really common, and it generally just ruins the fun of like using it as whole, and we don't enjoy it in general. That's why the technology increase was just like not beneficial for teenagers at all, right? The second argument is about safety. Now there are many reasons as to why the 2020s were a lot more safer, but the most important was obviously the pandemic, right? When we decided to live in survival mode and when we decided to live in this global pandemic full of isolation, we had a lot of disadvantages. Firstly, we were like really depressed. We felt really isolated from people, and secondly there was no development physically and mentally because we were basically focusing on like surviving life, right? We were on complete survival mode and we didn't focus on our development or live life to the fullest. Because of this, there are probably many teenagers who go into the future and like regret their teenage years simply because they didn't live life to the fullest, simply because they didn't enjoy their teenage years as much as they were supposed to. And for all these reasons, we're so proud to propose this debate.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that fine speech. Just a reminder to the audience, please maintain silence while the speaker is speaking. Be respectful for them, and just make sure they're not disturbed while they're giving that speech. With that in mind, inviting first speaker opposition to begin the case for opposition. Here. First speaker opposition, you're up.
Hello.
Whenever you're ready.
I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. As the first speaker, 3 major things will be saying in my speech. Firstly, some engagement, reframing, and wider implications. Firstly, let's do some engagement with propositions case, right? Firstly, let's understand how they talk about pandemics, right? Panel, please note, back in the day, if there were pandemics back in the 1980s, please note that the pandemic would have a greater impact. Because why? Today there are many disease prevention measures, but then back in the day, when we did not have anything, there were many widespread diseases. Whatever they say about the 2020s won't really stand in our case. Why? Just because there's better disease prevention, and then even if COVID-19 happened back in the day, it would cause a bigger impact in this debate. Secondly, and most importantly, when they come up and talk about education, please note on how. Secondly, and most importantly, how they talk about social media, right? Under social media, we need to understand one thing. Education does exist, right? And even if you talk about bullying, please know that this bullying is not exclusive on our side of the house. On their side of the house, what happens is that there are less measures to prevent bullying as a whole, right? This is one major strategic mistake which we see on proposition side. Secondly, let's move on to my framing, right? Panel, let me reframe the burdens here. Our burden as proposition is to prove on how the 2020s was as a whole a better era for teenagers as compared to 1980s, and our proposition will have to tell us why living in 1980s is better as compared to 2020s, not why 2020s is bad. Because everything we hear from proposition first speaker is why 2020s was bad, right? We never hear critical reasons on why 1980s was better. And let's understand what the 1980s era looks like, right? Proposition has created a really biased and faulty narrative. Let me paint a crystal clear picture for you, right? In 1980s, teenagers were oppressed a lot. Back in the day, a teen would have the same responsibility, not same, but almost as much as a father would have, right? This is something which they would not be able to prove in this debate, right? Panel, why does this debate mainly exist? Firstly, because the proposition's false premise when they believe that 1980s was perfect, right? And we need to understand how this utopia doesn't really exist, right? Secondly, what does 2020s looks like, i.e. status quo? Firstly and most importantly, as I've mentioned in my rebuttals, the one major impact which we have seen is that there is better education, better social media, and technology, right? And also we need to notice how there is better disease prevention methods. COVID-19 wasn't really a problem at all. Why? Because we had disease prevention methods. If this same pandemic happened in the 1980s, it would have had a bigger devastating impact, right? And even if they tell us that how we all became lonely after this COVID-19 pandemic, we need to understand that social media was a thing. That is when social media became a really boom. When it became a really boom, when there was COVID-19, when we all moved onto our screens to meet new people, something which really would not happen in the 1980s, right? And technology, we need to understand how technology has evolved rapidly to the point where every teen in almost every corner of the world has access to the internet. This has proven to be a major revolution, and it has transformed the life of many teenagers, right? And today, if we see, we have the autonomy to move around restricted. But in 1920s, what will happen, right? In 1920s, you cannot go out without asking permission from your parents. And will your parents grant you permission? No, that's not really likely. My second speaker will be talking more about that. Now moving on to wider implications. Firstly and most importantly, we need to understand about education. Education has evolved rapidly, right? Back in the day, what would happen is that education was not as widely accessible as today. Many schools and colleges, today what we see is that there are many schools and colleges in each and every corner. But then back in the day, no. There was one school in every 3 localities, and having a school was more like a luxury, right? We also need to understand how a lot of families didn't believe in the value of education, didn't believe in the value of education or in the importance of education, right? That meant that even if teens wanted to go and get themselves educated, that would not really happen with these parents, right? Why? Because of this vicious cycle, where they know that education doesn't play a major role. And this is how they were restricted by parental pressure, and also how there is forced labor and child labor. My second speaker will be expanding on that. Secondly, also need to understand, as I've told you, that how education, according to the parents, was a waste, right? Why? Because they believed instead of spending money in getting the child educated, they could instead send the child to labor and get money, right? Because back in the day, these families were not as rich as we are, were not as developed as we are. Money was given great importance to. Even if it was $1, they would give their lives for it, right? Hence, they believe that instead of spending money on the child's education, it is better that we send them to work and get money. And what do we see today? Education has widely been given importance to. There is school and colleges in almost each and every corner. And back in the day, even if education was given importance to, parents did not have resources to send the children for education, right? And we also need to understand today in this modern era, there is holistic development. Because back in the day, the only thing that was given importance to was rote learning. My children need to study because I'm paying money for it. But this is not what we see today. Today what we see, there is holistic development is widely given importance to. Every school is ranked on the order of holistic development. Sports is really given importance to, cultural development. And today we are having these rendezvous. Why? Because in 2020s, holistic development has been given importance to. This same rendezvous would not have existed if it was in the 1920s, right? Secondly, curriculum has upgraded a lot. As I said back in the day, rote learning was a really major problem, right? This would even force students to leave their education. But then today, education has been encouraged a lot. Education has also been made fun, not just a pressure or boredom on the students, right? As a teenager, that's why we as a teenagers would really love to live in the 1820s. Here is my kids, so proud of you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that fine speech. Inviting second speaker proposition to begin to continue their case whenever they're ready. Thank you.
Am I audible? I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think Team Opposition lives in an unrealistic world where the right to education was not a thing in the 1980s and there was absolutely no access to anything in the 1980s. I'll be doing 3 things in my speech. Firstly, proving to you why whatever opposition has said so far is factually untrue and rebutting it. Secondly, giving my argumentation. And lastly, a little bit of a comparative analysis as to why we weigh in and win today's debate. Firstly, unlike rebuttals, right? And before I begin with this, right, I think I'd like to clarify one thing, right? There are 3 things that are the most important things to each and every teenager sitting here right now. Firstly, enjoyment. Secondly, success. And lastly, safety and security. If these 3 most important things are not provided on Team Opposition's case, then they fail to prove why they as teenagers are more likely to live in the 2020, are more likely to enjoy living in the 2020s than in the 1980s. Moving on, they talk about how if there were pandemics in the 1980s, it would be more difficult to tackle. But I think we need to understand something, right? And that is that when we look at the status quo, we take a lot of things for granted. What this means is that healthcare in and of itself, the entire healthcare system and preventive measures against healthcare are more likely to be taken in or are more likely to be taken for granted on their side of the house, which means that people or teenagers in and of itself are less likely to opt into preventive measures in and of itself. We concede to the fact that healthcare did not develop as much in the 1980s, but it still developed to the degree where it was manageable to tackle pandemics in and of itself. Secondly, they talk about how teenagers had the same responsibility as adults in the 1980s. I think something we need to understand is that this still exists in the 2020s, right? Like, look at marginalized communities, like, look at rural areas. Teenagers are still being forced to work, teenagers are still being sent for child labor and so on and so forth. It is easy to say that having responsibilities exist. But the problem is that even in the 1980s, this is not the 1900s we're talking about, right? Even in the 1980s, these responsibilities existed majorly in rural areas, marginalized communities. In today's debate, we talk about where an average teenager, as in all of us sitting here, would like to live, right? And lastly, they talk about how education exists more in the status quo. I think we need to understand something, right? And that is that the right to education was still a thing in the 1980s in most countries. What this means is that most people still had access to education. Most people were still getting their basic level of literacy. And it was easier to access job opportunities or opportunities with this standard level of education in and of itself, which is going to be in my argumentation as well. Now, let's talk about argumentation, right? And how two major arguments in my speech will prove to you why team proposition wins today's debate, right? Firstly, on education and being successful, I think we need to understand something, right? Conceding to the fact that education exists on both sides of the house, we need to understand that even with a certain amount of education, it is still more likely for me as a teenager to be more successful on our side of the house. What does this mean? I think we need to understand something, and that is that every single person sitting in this auditorium right now is facing severe competition. What this means is that it's a rat race that exists in the status quo right now. Why is this so? This is because we see that there's a large number of extracurriculars that are required, there's a large number of AP classes that are required, a lot of things that are required. The JEE race is insane. So many things that exist in today's world in the 2020s which did not exist to as big of a magnitude in the 1980s, which will essentially stifle growth and which will essentially lead to I as a teenager being less likely to be successful on opposition side of the house. They might come to you and tell you that, oh, there's less opportunity or there's less access. I think we need to understand we need to understand something, that this is inherently untrue, and this is because it is more likely that we face extensive competition in the status quo. So much so that even if the opportunity is more, the competition increases more on their side of the house, which means that the competition that exists is more than the opportunity that exists, which inherently tells you that it is less likely that an average teenager is able to become successful in the status quo. Take a look at the world as it is right now, right? The unemployment rate that exists right now is far, far higher than it was 20 years ago, right? Which means that we are less likely to actually be able to be successful. And lastly, on enjoyment in and of itself, right? I think the likelihood of enjoyment is more likely in the 1980s than it is in the 2020s, right? People are less likely to enjoy the 2020s because Aliza already tells you that bullying is less likely to take place in an extended way in the 1980s because it is more likely to end in school. Your home is a safe space and so on and so forth. We also talk about how technology was new, and new means more fun. I as a teenager am more likely to opt into technology and have more fun with it in the 1980s than I am in the 2020s. Also, I'm less likely to engage in self-harm because of the lack of knowledge and the lack of reasons to take part in self-harm because of the fact that enjoyment was more on our side of the house. Panel, forget everything we say. It is still important to note that I, as a teenager, am more likely to live life to the fullest, to have less stress, and to have more reasons to be safe and have more ways to be safe on proposition side of the house, thus proving our case, thus telling you why teenagers should be more likely to live in the 1980s.
Thank you so much for all of the time. Please invite second speaker opposition to continue their case whenever they're ready. Here, here.
Am I audible? I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, as the second speaker on team opposition side, I'll be doing a few major things today. Firstly, refutations. Secondly, argumentations. And lastly, a wider implication and a comparative analysis on which side, is better for teenagers, as they're the stakeholders of today's debate. So, firstly, let's start with rebuttals, right? Team proposition comes up and states 3 major things as the necessity to win this debate: enjoyment, success, safety, and security. Now, let's focus on safety, security, and enjoyment, right? Firstly, on social media, let's be realistic, social media, while it does have some sort of harm to like a really, really small extent, it does create more enjoyment, it does create more connectivity. Let's be real, people in the current world, teenagers in the current world, sitting in this auditorium are far more connected than any teenager ever would be in like an auditorium in the 1980s. Not because of some physical interaction. Why? Because of social media and technology and stuff which team proposition themselves has existed on a larger basis on like our side or in the 2020s. So yeah, enjoyment is better on team opposition side. Even though they speak about, how holistic, we speak about how holistic development, skills, APs, sports, games, all these things exist on team opposition side. Meanwhile, team proposition, what does a day in school for a teenager look like on team proposition side, right? You're going to school, you're studying like 6 subjects, and then you're going back home. And more on top of that, you're gonna face some ragging and bullying, etc. even more, which team proposition even considered to. I'll come back to that in a bit. But in team opposition side, on team opposition side, we tell you that there's holistic development of these students. They're going to be doing activities, they're going to be doing sports. The rendezvous today that's happening is simply because of the holistic development in today's curriculum, and we do not see any of this happening in a school in the 1980s. Why? Because schools in the 1980s did not care about holistic development of the students or like the well-rounded development of the students, focusing on activities, sports, etc. So the enjoyment factor is completely taken by team opposition. Now, moving on to my argumentation, no thank you, let's focus mainly on safety and security, right? My major argument for today will be on inclusivity, 3 major layers to this. Firstly, racism, right? In the 1980s, let's be real, teenagers are going to face some racism. This was before, this was during the time apartheid was happening. This was during the time, like, post-independence for like many countries that faced colonization. So think about it, right? In today's world, we're seeing so many post-colonization effects. Like, we're seeing post-colonization effects. Things like fair and lovely, they're still comparing people and like, wanting people to have brighter skin or whatever. Think about the magnitude of the impact that would be there in 1980s, like less than 40 years after independence, right? The magnitude would be far more, and therefore the post-colonization effect in like many countries such as India would still be felt to a large extent even by teenagers going to schools, and even in like non-colonized countries or like in the whole African continent as a whole. So for teenagers, let's just see how that affects their safety and security, right? Now, on to schools. Again, this post-colonization effect, bullying, etc. Like, ragging still exists to a large basis in the 1980s, right? All this physical bullying, team proposition came up in their first speaker speech, and they said, okay, even if in the 1980s I get bullied physically in school, I'm gonna go home and be happy. Like, what does that really mean, right? How are you gonna go home and suddenly lose all that anger, lose all that hate? Tomorrow, you have to go back to the same school, you have to face the same bullying, the same ragging, if not worse. How is that better on team proposition side? On our side, there's anti-bullying campaigns going around. Since there's inclusivity, since there's social media, there's these campaigns going around, right? People know about bullying, people are more aware socially about these issues, about the mental health of like the students or of teenagers, about the harms it inflicts upon them. No, thank you. And like, they speak about this in school. Things happen in school that prevent bullying on a larger basis. Social media bullying has also been prevented in the 2020s with like, reporting abuse or etc. Now, moving on to the second layer, sexism. In the 1980s, sexism was there on a large basis. In education, for teenagers, primarily for education, girls were not given as high of an opportunity to get educated as they are today in the 2020s. The girls weren't subject to education as much as they are in the present scenario. Or why does this happen in the 1980s? Simply because people weren't educated, people weren't aware, so none of this happened. Now, no, thank you. Adding on to my first speaker's speech, he spoke about technology, he spoke about education, right? How is education better for teenagers in the 2020s than it was in the 1980s? Firstly, edutech, right? Edutech, learning from home, or learning from a YouTube video has become far more accessible in today's world than it was before. Even if you're sick, you're absent or something like that, you can still sit at home and follow up a lecture by some YouTube teacher who's really, really skilled, right? We don't see any of this happening in team propositions world in the 1980s, where they considered that technology is not as developed. Now, We spoke about the holistic development of vocational skills, etc. That's happening on our side with education. So how is this better for teenagers on the safety and security metric? Right? On our side, we told you that there's going to be lesser racism. Why? Because there's these anti-bullying campaigns and more social awareness, more social media awareness that's happening in today's world than it was in the 1980s. There's less sexism because people are educated, they're aware of the opportunities teenagers need. They know that girls and guys should be treated equally as teens, or as adults, as young adults, whatever, in the world. And then there's also lesser child labor, even though they spoke about how child labor is there on our side as well, but it's far less than it was in the 1980s. Child labor still existed in the city areas to some extent, even in the 1980s. With that, we proved to you how the enjoyment and safety and security metric are there better on team opposition side. With that, I'd like to end this debate and call the jury to decide for team opposition.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Just a reminder to the audience, please maintain silence when the speaker is on stage. Please respect them. It's just out of basic courtesy. We want to be able to hear what they're saying. You wouldn't want someone to be talking when you're on stage. Just a reminder. And secondly, please you're only allowed 15 seconds when you're asked to come on the podium. Do not take more than 15 seconds. With that being said, inviting third speaker proposition to finish the proposition constructive of that case. Here.
Am I audible? I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Panel, as third speaker, you can expect two things in my speech. First of all, I'll be doing the rebuttals and refutations of proposition, and then we'll bring my three major clashes. Now, first with rebuttals, right? So they said about how education exists online and how it's more widespread right now in 2020. Now, why is this wrong? Because first of all, education was also widespread back then. We see that obviously the system of abolishing slavery and abolishing and increasing the fact that students or children or teenagers should actually go to school was more widespread back in the 1980s. And right now, if you look at how children or how education should exist online, we see that teenagers could easily cheat, and this would obviously bring down the development, right? Next is they said about how teenagers has proposition first speaker said about teenagers have a lot of responsibilities and how a son could have as much responsibilities as his father would have. Now, why is this wrong? This is because as a teenager, you're obviously gonna have responsibilities, right? Now, this could be in any scale. This depends on how your family raised you, and this is why responsibility is going to bring you up as an individual or as a teenager. Now, if you didn't have these responsibilities, this would make you irresponsible and this would make you lazy. This is why parents put in the fact that you should be responsible from a young age. Now, they also said about how there's going to be restrictions from going outside, or about how these teenagers back then weren't allowed to go outside very often. Now, why is this wrong? Because first of all, in the 1980s, you're bound to see teenagers playing outside, right? That was their prime about when they used to play games rather than staying at home playing video games. Next is about how in the 2020s, there was a pandemic. What did this pandemic do? The pandemic restricted teenagers from going outside. This meant that there was this entire lockdown and how teenagers couldn't even step their foot outside. So this proves that in proposition side, there's an even worse chance of having this restriction of going outside. Next is about how this discrimination exists on both sides of the case, right? How is this possible? This discrimination exists more on opposition side. Because I, as a Muslim, I'm going to be more in danger in India than I would be in 1980s, right? I would be in more danger because Hindu-Muslim unity was more widespread in 1980s than it is now. Now the situation has worsened. Plus, I as a Muslim female in America would likely to have racism, would likely to expect more racism in the status quo. Now why is this possible? Because this leads to, there's extreme groups in the USA which easily causes more racism in 2020s, which is way worse than what it was like in the 1980s. Next is about how obviously teenagers nowadays, they want to have this huge advancement of friends, right? You want to have this huge collection of friends, even though they might be fake, even though they might be your real friends, it doesn't matter, because teenagers nowadays have this desire to have more friends. Now what does this do? This leads to lack of proper friends, or lack of a stable friend, right? But back then they didn't really care. No, thank you. Back then they didn't really care about how many friends they had. Next is they said about how there's less holistic development back then, or about how culture wasn't widespread because we have cultural rendezvous, but back then there wasn't like things like this, right? This is completely wrong. Why? Because culture, the main point of culture was erupting from the past, and how this happened is because of the people in the 1980s who actually caused this entire culture in the past. Now I'll be doing my clashes, right? So panel, I have three major clashes in this debate, which align with the best interests of teenagers nowadays and in the past. First of all, safety. Second of all, success. And lastly, the enjoyment of these teenagers. Now to start off with safety, in the safety perspective, teenagers in the 2020s were so unsafe, right? Both outdoors and indoors. As my first speaker has already said, imagine getting bullied at school, and when you come home, you're gonna open your DMs and you're gonna see another message of, oh, you're ugly. Now this is going to repeat again and again, right? Back in 1980s, when you're getting bullied outside, you can come home, you can feel safe, right? But in 2020, you get the same bullying over and over again, even in your home space, even in the entire comfort zone that you are in. Now, let me state this one, let me make this statement that mental bullying is way worse than physical bullying, right? And this is obviously the case more in today's status quo. We see that suicide rates have increased so high nowadays because there isn't any safe place for these teenagers to live in. We say teenagers didn't even know how to kill themselves back then. There wasn't this entire point of like suiciding very often, right? But now teenagers slice their throats, they cut their wrists, or even induce them with drugs very often. Solely because of the reason that they are unsafe indoors and outdoors, because of the rise in social media, because of the rise being bullied indoors and outdoors, especially online. Next is on the success rate, right? We see that every teenager aspires to become successful, every teenager aspires to become a millionaire or a billionaire in the future. But imagine the competition rates, right? We see that back then, the competition rates were as high. Nowadays, you see 2 lakh teenagers writing the main JEE exam that you would be writing back then, which was obviously way less. What does this lead to? What does this lead to today? This leads to less scope of success or less scope of development, right? We see that example, if my dad went to a good decent university back in 1980s, the chance for me to get into that same university would be 10 times more difficult, obviously because I have to do the things 10 times more than he did. I have to get extracurriculars, I have to get good academics to get into the same decent university. An average teenager would be easily gotten into back in the 1980s. Lastly is on enjoyment. The main point of a teenager is to enjoy in life, right? As a teenager in the 1980s, they could easily go outside and have fun. But in 2020s, I'm in a lockdown. I'm stuck in my bedroom and isolated overall. Even though teenagers can make friends online, it's not ideal. Why? Because number one, because you don't know if that person is a serial killer online. Number two, because you don't know who that person is and it's very unsafe for you. Here I my case, never been so proud to propose.
Thank you so much for that fine speech. Just a reminder, speakers, if you're talking about self-harm, please give a trigger warning. It may be disruptive to someone if you're talking about self-harm. Thank you so much. With that being said, inviting third speaker opposition to finish the constructive part of opposition's case, whenever you're ready.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Here's what we hear from side proposition in this debate. Technology is the worst thing that's happened to you. Here's why it's not. I'm the third speaker for side opposition, and I'll start off by offering some hard rebuttal, after which I'll move on to my clashes, which will also include integrated rebuttal, and lastly, some weighing. So let's start off with the very first speaker of side proposition, and just a quick part where they had a lot of mischaracterization. Here's what proposition first speaker tells me that catches my attention. The needs of interests of proposition first speaker would be better fulfilled in the 1980s. But here's what I tell you. If this was the 1980s, neither proposition first speaker would be able to speak on this stage because of the prevalent sexism. And my second speaker's already rebutted this indirectly, but I want to ask you, do you really think in 1980s a woman would be allowed on this stage in front of this many people to debate on a topic like this? Quite literally, no. So let's see. Here's what their speaker tells us. They tell us that social media was much better back in the day because, it was new and it was so much better and there was an overuse of tech. And they tell us how this overuse of tech throughout their speeches is increasing bullying. Yes, we concede to the fact that sure, till some extent, social media might be, able to spread bullying more, but I also tell you, this goes hand in hand with the fact that there are anti-bullying campaigns. So this was also one of the major clashes, which I'll come to later. Then here's what proposition's second speaker tells us. There are three things important to us teenagers: enjoyment, success, safety, and security. Yes, accepted. No, I don't think so, because even when this movement was going on, women were actively being oppressed simply because of the reason, and also because of the reason they were taking part into these suffrage movements, they were having to suffer a lot more. At least in the present, because the women back then suffered, the teenagers right now are able to opt in more easily. So, opting in reminds me, their second speaker told us, healthcare is taken for granted, so these teenagers won't opt in. Here's what, it doesn't work that way. Firstly, why is healthcare taken for granted? Because it is so accessible. So is proposition trying to come up to us and tell us that the accessibility of healthcare is bad? But even if we forget that and be like, okay, they are taking this for granted, they aren't. Simply because they're in the present status quo, because of the very technology that proposition tries to paint as the worst thing in this world, we tell you there's so much more awareness about diseases in general, because of which teenagers and people in general, but especially teenagers who are very hyper aware of their environment, these people are able to opt in more because they know the symptoms and they know all of this. Then their second speaker tells us that this debate is about an average person, and you know how the poor people still have to suffer, which is why the past is better. But I tell you, because this debate is about an average person, we win. Here's why. Because back in the day, the average person, as both of my speakers have told you, had to undergo racism, sexism, and child labor. But right now, while I do agree that people have to go under child labor, these are people at the lower section of society. But back in the day, this was the case for quite literally every person to agree. Which means also, secondly, they tell us about responsibilities. We hear quite contradictory things throughout their speeches about responsibilities. Their second speaker tells us about how a person in the present has more responsibilities, but as I just said, back in the day, the average teenager, had more responsibilities. But then their third speaker comes up to us and tells us something along the lines of, responsibility is necessary because without responsibility, children won't be able to grow up into better adults. Which is why we're telling you that the kind of responsibility we're giving to teenagers today is much better than the kind of working in coal mines that they had to do in the 1980s. That's just my opinion. They can disagree, perhaps. Then they talk about pandemic. Now, this was already rebutted by my speaker, but the third speaker brought it up anyways. The thing is, even though there was a pandemic in the 2020s, I want to tell you, we are all here today, and we are thriving better than ever. But if this was the case in 1980s, where there were so many diseases, by the way, and because of technological advancement right now, we're able to overcome them, back in the 1980s, the mortality rates were much, much, much higher. Talking about mortality rates, let's talk about mental health, suicide. They tell us that it's much worse today because of social media. But I tell you, it's much better today because of awareness and because of the fact that mental health resources are accessible to each and every person to a large extent as compared to then. And something I found quite weird is they tell us that a teenager back in the day didn't know how to commit suicide. Okay. Their third speaker talks about the Islamophobia and racism in America right now. What if I tell you that in the 1980s, if you went out with a hijab, the church would come and catch you? So that's up to you. Would you rather some person come and make some comments at you, or would you rather have an autocratic empire come and jump you? Since I'm running out of time because they gave me a lot of things to talk about, there are basically three major clashes in this debate. Inclusivity and oppression, which my second and first speaker explained pretty properly about because, they tell us physical activity, etc., etc. But even if I concede the fact in their best case scenario where there was more physical activity and enjoyment back in the day, I think I as a person would prefer not to get racist comments in everywhere I go, rather than I would have someone just bully me instead. Anyways, then second clash was a lot about technology. They painted as the worst thing possible. We've tell you. So this debate at the end of the day boils down to one thing. Would I rather have a little bit less developed technology where the internet is slightly more fun? It's not. But would I rather have that, or would I have better rights? Would I have my voice matter on this stage? And what would I have? Would I work in a coal mine, or would I want my voice to matter? With that, I rest my case, and I tell you, we win our every sale. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for both of the fine speech. Now to finish the side of opposition, finish Tulip House case for this debate, inviting the vice speaker from opposition, here.
be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Panel, Team Proposition paints a world where the 1980s was filled with rainbows and lilacs, where everybody went outside and all they could do was play in the sunshine and enjoy their day, right? But this is not an average day in the 1980s. An average day in the 1980s, as we told you previously, would be filled with racism, sexism, child labor, oppression, and lack of inclusivity, right? They tell us, now I'll be weighing off the debate on a few major scales, principle and practical basis. So firstly, let's look at practical, right? They talk about how on their side there's more enjoyment and inclusivity because, oh, at the end of the day, I can step outside in the sun and I can play with all my friends, which I have because I don't care about self-harm and I don't have any other issues to worry about. But then notice how they like in their very first speech, they mentioned about how like bullying on their side was more physical than it was on online. So when you're stepping out, you're basically exposing yourself to bullying, to more racism, to more sexism than on team opposition side. We told you about how on our side, there's none of this happening because there's social awareness, because there's campaigns going around, because people are more educated, aware, and literate in the current world than they were at all in the 1980s, right? So on our side, like the whole enjoyment basis is taken over than on team proposition side. Then let's move on to safety and security. Panel, even if we ignore enjoyment and success, let's look at the very basic metric of a teenager, what a teenager would really want, right? Safety and security. This is the very metric team proposition fails on. They talk about how, oh, there's the pandemic on our side, there's the pandemic in the 2020s and people are stuck inside, and like how teenagers, because they have more access to like medical technology or whatever, they're more aware. But panel, that's not what's really happening, right? On our side, we told you that, okay, firstly, the pandemic was cured or like done better with in like our world than ever would have been on team proposition's world in the 1980s. Why does this happen? Because of medical technology being more developed, because of like the technology being so much better, and disease prevention. Panel, on team proposition side, every minor disease, every single disease that came up like on a regular basis was treated as a big major thing. Why? Because there was no disease prevention and this very basic metric of safety for a teenager was not there, right? Now, let's talk about security. How they fail on the grounds of racism, sexism, child labor, and so many other social issues. So, where does this take us back to, panel? On our side, we told you that these teens, at the end of the day, they're safer and they enjoy more. Sure, they still have a higher chance of success than they do on a teen in the 1980s. Why? Because there's a very high chance a teen in the 1980s is never gonna get educated, right? What chance of success do you have when you're not getting educated and you're wasting away your entire teenage in a coal mine or somewhere like, back of a room doing some manual labor work? There's no chance of success on their side. So we succeeded on all three metrics the proposition mentioned of safety, security, success, and enjoyment. With that, we win this debate. Never been so proud to oppose.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that fine speech. Now to finish this debate, finish the first on-stage event of Fraud Debate 2025, inviting the final proposition whenever you're ready.
Once again, am I audible? Right. I'll be starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. I think team proposition wins today's debate because of the sole fact that team opposition thinks that instead of this house would rather live in this house as a teenager would rather live in the 1980s than 2020s, they are talking about a world which was far, far before the 1980s, as in like the 1900s or something like that. Because yeah, sure, sexism, racism, all of these things did exist in the 1980s. They were still much more mitigated on their side of the house. How can we prove this in today's debate? Couple of things, right? Firstly, I think we need to understand that, take a look at your auditorium, right? How many of your parents who are female are working? I would like to say above 50% of your parents who are female are working. This means that females did have education. There was still opportunity provided to females in and of itself in the 1980s. That means that on their side of the house, this whole point that they talk about sexism does not really exist as much. Secondly, on like racism, right? They talk about how racism is existing far more on their side of the house. I think we need to understand something, right? the fact is that even if we concede to the fact that social media has reduced a little bit of racism, it has made it so that the extremist groups are much more easily able to perpetrate the knowledge about racism, easily able to perpetrate their ideologies more in the 2020s. This means that on their side of the house, whatever we see about racism, sexism, all of these ideologies are inherently untrue. But then, let me start off my clashes by asking all of you here, how many teenagers sitting in today's auditorium have taken part in self-harm during the pandemic times, cutting their wrists, cutting their arms, and so on and so forth? I think we need to understand that the likelihood of this happening in the 2020s is far more. Why is this so? Throughout our speeches, we've told you that the knowledge about this is far, far more. What this means is that on our side of the house, teenagers are less likely to engage in self-harm and so on and so forth. This is inherently true because of the fact that look at the suicide rates among teenagers, right? It's far worse in the 2020s than it is in the 1980s in and of itself. Look at the life expectancy rates. They talk about how healthcare is far worse in the 1980s in and of itself. But then why do we see that the life expectancy in the 1980s was far more than the life expectancies in the 2020s in and of itself, right? People were living longer, people were having more successful lives. But then, let's talk about how they fail to engage with the topic. They fail to engage with one of the most important things in today's debate, and that is the success of a teenager. As a teenager, I am more likely to be successful in the 1980s as an average teenager because of the fact that education, opportunity, and the standard of success was far lower. What this means is that on our side of the house, we've proven to you how because the standard of success is lower, teenagers have less pressure on them to opt into many extracurriculars, many AP exams, many courses, and so on and so forth to actually succeed in life. Secondly, they talk about how we say that social media and technology is a bad thing. I think we need to clarify this in my reply speech, right? We never say that technology is a bad thing. We say that we tell you that the existence of technology in and of itself in such a large way is so bad. Why is this so? I think we need to understand that throughout our speeches we've proven to you about how technology teenagers being acclimated to technology in and of itself is a bad thing. Meanwhile, on proposition side of the house, living in the 1980s, growing up with arcades, having fun, having VCDs and all of these things were much more entertaining and much more fun on our side of the house, which is why teenagers would be more likely to have fun on our side of the house. Lastly, on being safe and safety in and of itself, right? I think we've proven on our side of the house how a house is a safe space, on how a home is a safe space. What this means is that on their side of the house, we see that bullying and all of these major harms exist even after one reaches home. What this means is that people are less likely to actually be able to feel safe in our side of the house, on their side of the house, which is why I, as a teenager, would much prefer living in the 1980s than in the 2020s. Urge the jury to side with team opposition.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that fine speech. Thank you so much to both sides. I guess that ends the debate. Thank you so much.
Did you guys enjoy the debate?